He was just a cowboy going into the forest for firewood. But when he reached the ancient oak, the ground opened beneath him. What he found inside changed everything. Subscribe to the channel and write in the comments where you're watching from. The morning sun had not yet risen when Ethan Caldwell rose from his narrow bed. The air inside the ranch house carried the chill of the desert night, and for a moment he stood still, listening to the faint stirring of the cattle outside the window and the distant bray of a mule. Life on the edge of the western frontier did not allow for laziness or hesitation. Every day was marked by a rhythm that was older than him and his kin, dictated by the land, the animals, and the seasons. Ethan pulled on his worn boots, their leather softened by years of dust and sweat, and reached for his hat that hung from a peg near the door. The brim was bent and sun-bleached, but it was as familiar to him as the lines of his own face. Outside, the world was waking slowly. The smell of dry earth mingled with the faint sweetness of sage, carried by the early breeze. The horses shifted in the corral, snorting as they sensed him approach. He filled the trough with water drawn from the well, the rope creaking as he pulled up the heavy bucket, droplets sparkling in the dim light. He scattered feed for the chickens, who clucked greedily and fluttered around his boots, their wings stirring up dust. These small tasks anchored him, reminders that no matter how wild the West seemed, a man could carve order from it through habit and care. Yet as he worked, he felt the tug of another need. The woodpile by the house was dwindling, the logs stacked there already small and uneven. Nights had grown colder, and he knew that the chill of the approaching season would soon seep through the thin walls. It was time to replenish the supply. He thought of his grandfather, who had always cut wood from the same grove to the north, a stand of oak trees that had stood for generations while the prairie winds carved the land around them. The old man had spoken of that grove in a hushed voice, calling it a place of secrets. Ethan had dismissed those stories as the ramblings of an aging man who had spent too many nights by the fire with whiskey in his hand. But the oak wood was strong, burned hot and long, and Ethan was practical above all else. He slung a coil of rope across his shoulder, a rope his father had once used to bind stacks of firewood, and strapped the gasoline can for the saw against the saddle. His tools were simple but sufficient: a battered axe, sharp enough to fell branches if needed, and the chainsaw he had bought from a trader in town, its foreign hum still a curiosity among men used to swinging steel. With these, he rode out toward the grove, the horses' hooves drumming a steady rhythm against the dry earth. The path stretched ahead, narrow and uneven, bordered by tufts of brittle grass that whispered as the breeze bent them. A hawk circled high above, its shadow sweeping across the land. The air smelled faintly of dust and sun-warmed stone, familiar scents of his world. But as he drew closer to the grove, subtle changes unsettled him. Birds that usually darted through the sky had grown silent, as if the forest beyond held some unseen predator. The usual chatter of prairie dogs was absent. Even the horse shifted uneasily, ears flicking back and forth, as though it heard something Ethan could not. The grove appeared at last, dark against the brightness of the prairie, its trees older and taller than the scattered cottonwoods and mesquite that dotted the land. Their trunks were thick, gnarled by time, and their roots clawed deep into the soil as if they sought to hold the earth itself in place. At the heart of this grove stood one tree that towered above all others, a massive oak blackened with age, its bark scarred and ridged like the skin of some ancient beast. It was this tree that the elders of the settlement had once called the guardian of the forest. Ethan remembered the stories well enough, though he had always laughed them off. Still, as he approached, he felt something stir within him, a heaviness he could not name. He dismounted and tied his horse to a low branch at the edge of the grove. The animal pawed the ground nervously, tossing its head, reluctant to remain near the towering oak. Ethan gave it a reassuring pat and turned toward the tree. The ground beneath its sprawling roots seemed different from the rest of the forest floor. Where grass and undergrowth should have flourished, the soil had sagged inward, leaving a shallow depression. It looked as though the earth itself had collapsed, forming a hollow that gaped between the roots like the mouth of a cavern. Ethan crouched to examine it more closely. As he brushed aside layers of dead leaves and moss, a faint current of air rose from below, cool and stale against his skin. It carried with it a smell unlike the fresh dampness of the forest, an older scent, like stone sealed away from sunlight for centuries. His first instinct was caution. He had come for wood, not for mysteries, and his family depended on him to provide. But curiosity pressed harder than reason. He began to clear the hollow more thoroughly, scraping away the soil with his hands, tugging at twisted roots that had grown across the opening. With each handful removed, the hole widened until he could see a rough passage descending into darkness. For a long moment, he knelt there, the forest silent around him, his breath loud in his ears. He felt as though he stood at the edge of two worlds, the one he knew, bound by ranching and chores, and another that pulsed with ancient secrets beneath the ground. His grandfather's words returned to him unbidden, warnings about the grove and its hidden depths. Ethan had dismissed them then, but now he understood that they were born not of drunken fancy, but of something remembered, something guarded. The shadows within the passage seemed to beckon him. He straightened, brushing the dirt from his palms, and looked around. The forest was still, too still. The wind had died, the birds had not returned, and even the distant hum of the prairie felt muted. He knew he should walk away, return to his horse, cut the branches he had come for, and leave the place untouched. Yet his feet remained rooted. Something in that hollow called to him, a promise of knowledge, or perhaps a threat. As the evening light deepened and long shadows stretched across the grove, Ethan stood before the ancient oak, the yawning entrance at its roots, whispering of the unknown. He felt the weight of his choice press down on him, heavier than the burdens of ranch work or the hardships of the frontier. Without quite knowing why, he understood that this day, so ordinary in its beginning, had shifted into something else entirely. The path he had followed for Firewood had become the beginning of another journey, one that would carry him away from the simplicity of life on the ranch and into a darkness far older than his own bloodline. He lingered there, caught between fear and fascination, unaware that the decision he would make in that grove was already shaping his destiny. The oak loomed above him, silent and watchful, as though it had stood for centuries waiting for this very moment, waiting for him. The rancher who had set out that morning in search of firewood was no longer the same man. By nightfall, Ethan Caldwell would become something more than he had ever intended, a witness, and perhaps even a keeper, of secrets that the land itself had hidden for untold generations. The last light of day had dimmed when Ethan finally resolved to take a closer step toward the hollow beneath the oak. He felt the air breathe up from that dark mouth in the earth, cold and stale, as though it had been trapped for centuries. His hands, rough from years of ranch work, tightened on the lantern he had brought with him in case dusk found him still in the grove. He struck a match, the flame catching quickly, filling the small glass chamber with a steady glow. The horse tied at the edge of the grove stamped its hooves and whinnied uneasily, but Ethan gave it no heed. The pull of the unknown was too strong. He leaned down, shifted aside the last clump of earth and root, and lowered himself into the opening. The descent was clumsy at first, the rough soil giving way beneath his boots, but soon his feet found a solid stone ledge. He crouched low, lantern extended, peering into the space below. The narrow shaft opened into a corridor carved straight into the earth, its walls rough, yet unmistakably worked by human hands. Ethan steadied himself, heart pounding. The ground was cold, the air thick with dampness. Each breath he drew seemed a taste of forgotten years. He took a tentative step forward, the lantern casting trembling shadows that crawled across the stone. As his eyes adjusted, the features of the place revealed themselves. The walls bore markings, faint but deliberate, gouged deeply into the stone in patterns that defied his understanding. Some resembled the jagged lines of mountains or rivers. Others swirled like curling smoke or coiled serpents. He could not read them, but he knew they had meaning. The ceiling, low enough to make him stoop, was blackened in places as though by smoke from fires long extinguished. He imagined torches carried by men who had walked these same passages in some age long before his birth, their flames licking against the rock as they performed acts he could not begin to imagine. The corridor extended farther than he expected. With each step, his lantern picked out fragments of the past scattered across the floor. Shards of pottery, their surfaces cracked and flaking, lay half buried in the dirt. Small piles of bones, brittle and white, protruded from corners as if discarded without care. Some were the bones of animals, deer perhaps, or smaller creatures, but others were human, their hollow sockets staring up at him from the dust. Ethan paused, the weight of their presence heavy upon him. He was no stranger to death. Life on the frontier was hard and unforgiving. Yet the stillness of these remains, entombed for so long in this underground silence, unsettled him in a way he could not explain. He pressed on, drawn deeper into the earth. The passage widened into a chamber supported by stone columns. The pillars, though crudely hewn, rose with an air of solemn strength, their surfaces etched with further carvings that spiraled upward like vines. In the glow of the lantern, the symbol seemed almost to shift, the shadows playing tricks on his eyes. He thought he glimpsed figures within the lines' faces, arms outstretched, shapes that might have represented gods or guardians. The silence of the place pressed against him, thick and unbroken, except for the faint echo of his own breathing. Near the center of the chamber lay a scattering of vessels, larger than those he had seen before. Some were toppled, their contents spilled into dust, but others remained upright, their rims chipped, yet intact. He bent low, brushing away the dirt that clung to one. The clay felt strange beneath his fingertips, smoother than any he had handled, its surface painted once, with patterns that time had nearly erased. Within the vessel lay a dark residue, the hardened remnant of something burned or poured away centuries ago. He recoiled slightly, not from disgust, but from the sudden awareness that he was disturbing what had been left here with intention. These were not the careless leavings of wanderers. They were offerings or sacrifices, placed by hands that believed in the power of the unseen. He lifted the lantern higher, its flame casting longer shadows across the chamber. The light revealed more bones, this time arranged in a circle near what looked to be an altar of stone. The slab was smooth, unlike the rough-hewn walls around it, and its surface bore faint stains that had darkened into the stone itself. Ethan's throat tightened. He did not need to imagine what had taken place there. The arrangement of the bones, the vessels nearby, the altar, all spoke of rituals performed in secret, of lives given up in service to beliefs that had vanished into dust. A tremor of unease coursed through him, yet he could not look away. He traced the outline of the chamber with the lantern until his eyes caught on something further back. A narrow passage led away, darker still, its opening framed by carvings more elaborate than the rest. The symbols were etched deeper, their lines bold, as if meant to warn or to guide. He stepped toward it, compelled, though every instinct screamed caution. His boots scraped against the stone floor, the sound unnaturally loud in the silence. The corridor beyond was steeper, leading him downward into a deeper chamber. The air grew colder, heavier, and the lantern flame flickered as though struggling against it. At last, the passage widened into a vast hall, larger than any space he had seen above ground. Columns rose in regular intervals, holding the ceiling aloft, and the walls were covered in sprawling designs that stretched as far as his light reached. Ethan turned slowly, his breath catching. The scale of it was overwhelming. This was no mere shelter or hiding place. It was a monument, a temple carved into the heart of the earth by a people who had sought permanence in stone. At the center of the hall lay a great depression, circular and blackened, as if it had once been filled with fire. Around its edges were smaller niches, some containing bones stacked carefully, others holding remnants of clay figures or tools. Ethan moved closer, his footsteps echoing hollowly. He could almost hear whispers, though he knew it was nothing more than the play of his own mind in the suffocating quiet. He lifted the lantern toward the far wall, and his breath stopped. There, carved across the expanse of stone, was a vast map, or at least something that resembled one. Lines cut deep into the rock branched outward in patterns that suggested tunnels, rivers, and valleys. Shapes that might have been mountains rose at the edges, and at the center, a mark, larger than the rest, radiated lines like the spokes of a wheel. Ethan stared at it, trying to make sense of the design. It looked both familiar and alien, as though it described not the world above but the world hidden beneath. He realized with a shiver that what he had entered was not merely a forgotten cavern, but part of a greater network, a system of passages stretching far beyond what he could see. The thought weighed upon him with crushing force. Who had built this, and why had it been abandoned? What had compelled a people to labor so deeply underground, carving halls and altars, leaving behind bones and vessels in their wake? And why had his grandfather and the men before him spoken of the grove with fear and reverence, warning against venturing too deep? He lowered the lantern, its glow shrinking as he turned back toward the way he had come. His mind swam with images of those who had once walked these corridors, chanting in tongues long dead, offering up their dead in hopes of appeasing unseen powers. He felt as though their eyes were still upon him, watching from the shadows, displeased with his intrusion. The silence pressed heavier now, as though the earth itself had grown hostile. He quickened his steps, heart hammering as he retraced his path. When at last he climbed back into the narrower corridor and caught sight of the faint glow of the surface above, relief coursed through him. He scrambled upward, dirt crumbling beneath his hands, until he emerged once more into the grove. The night had deepened, stars pricking the sky above, their cold light filtering through the branches of the guardian oak. The horse shifted nervously as he approached, ears laid back, nostrils flaring. Ethan did not speak to it, nor did he untie it immediately. He stood there, the lantern dim in his grasp, staring back at the dark hollow he had left behind. The world above was the same, yet nothing felt unchanged. The trees rustled faintly in the wind. The smell of earth and leaf filled his lungs. But to Ethan it all seemed altered, as though the grove itself had shifted in response to his trespass. He thought of the bones, the vessels, the altar, the vast hall with its carvings, the map etched across the stone wall. They were not the inventions of his imagination. They were real, carved and built by hands centuries gone. The weight of what he had seen settled on him like a mantle, pressing down with the knowledge that he now carried something he could neither share nor forget. The lantern flickered and went out, leaving only the pale light of the stars. Ethan stood in the darkness, the silence of the grove pressing around him, and knew that nothing in his life would ever again be simple. He had walked beneath the earth, and glimpsed a world lost to time, a world his forefathers had warned against. Now he had to live with the choice he had made, and with the secret that choice had placed upon his shoulders. And as he untied the horse and prepared to leave the grove behind, he felt the truth settle into his bones. He was no longer merely a rancher in search of firewood. He had become something else entirely, the bearer of a discovery that bound him to the land in ways he had yet to understand, and the first Caldwell in generations to step willingly into the forbidden depths beneath the guardian oak. The prairie sky was pale when Ethan rode back from the grove, lantern long extinguished, and the chill of the underground still clinging to his skin. The stars had given way to the early light of dawn, but he felt no comfort in its arrival. His horse had carried him swiftly from the oak grove, yet he could not escape the heavy knowledge pressing down upon him. The rhythm of hoofbeats across the hard earth echoed the pounding of his heart, each strike a reminder of what he had seen beneath the roots of the guardian oak. By the time the ranch house appeared on the horizon, low and weathered against the expanse of land, Ethan no longer felt he was returning home. It seemed instead that he was entering a different world, one made unfamiliar by the weight of hidden truth. He dismounted slowly, his body aching from the ride, though it was not physical strain that wore him down. It was memory, sharp and unrelenting. The smell of damp stone, the cold touch of stale air, the hollow sockets of skulls staring up at him from centuries of silence, all clung to him like shadows. He hung the bridle on its peg, ran a hand down the horse's trembling flank, and turned toward the house. Smoke from the hearth drifted lazily into the air, and the sound of chickens fussing in the yard reached his ears. These were the familiar signs of his life, yet they seemed out of place now, like echoes from a simpler time that no longer belonged to him. Inside, the house was warm, the fire crackling softly, but even its glow could not chase away the chill in his bones. He sat at the table, staring at the grain of the wood beneath his hands. Every knot, every line of the timber seemed to draw his eyes downward, as if the very boards carried reminders of the underground stone. He thought of telling someone, his neighbors, the men who met in the saloon in town, perhaps even the preacher who always sought meaning in old stories. But the thought of it filled him with dread. He could see it already. Men with shovels and lanterns swarming the grove, tearing into the earth with greedy hands, prying apart what had been sealed away. He could hear the clang of picks on stone, the shouts of discovery, the crack of gunfire when gold or relics became more important than honor. The place he had entered was not meant for such eyes, not meant to be claimed or catalogued. It had been preserved in silence for a reason. And yet, to remain silent himself was no easy task. The images pressed against his mind, demanding release, as though the very act of seeing had bound him to those who had come before. His grandfather's voice returned to him, half-remembered stories whispered late at night. Warnings not to wander too far into the oak grove. Tales of a tree older than the settlement, older even than the tribes that had once roamed these plains. Ethan had always dismissed them, but now he saw them for what they were, fragments of truth passed down as legend. His bloodline had known, perhaps not in detail, but in essence, that the grove hid something men should not disturb. The days that followed grew heavier with unease. The cattle balked at being driven toward the northern edge of the property, their eyes rolling white, their nostrils flaring as if they smelled danger in the wind. The dogs, loyal and unshakable, refused to follow him on rides toward the grove, stopping short and whining until he turned back. At night, he lay awake, listening to their howls, long and mournful, echoing across the prairie, as if answering some call only they could hear. Even the horses grew restless, kicking at their stalls, ears twitching toward the unseen. The land itself seemed unsettled, as though the balance had shifted since his descent beneath the oak. Neighbors began to notice. They came riding by with their easy greetings, speaking of weather and livestock. But their eyes lingered on him longer than usual. They asked if he was ill, for they saw the lines deepening around his eyes, the way his gaze drifted toward the horizon, as if he searched for something unseen. Ethan gave them no answers, only brief words and tighter smiles. He knew that if he faltered, if he let slip even a hint of what lay beneath the grove, curiosity would spread like fire through dry grass. Men would come with greed in their hearts, and nothing would stop them. Yet he could not deny the way the legends pressed closer, as though his silence had invited them to life. He remembered his grandfather speaking of watchers in the earth, guardians who punished those who sought what was forbidden. He remembered his father telling him as a boy never to cut wood too near the oak, to take only what the forest offered freely. At the time, he had thought it nothing more than superstition, the caution of men who feared what they did not understand. But now he felt the weight of those words in a way he never had before. It was not superstition. It was memory, carried from generation to generation, warning of a truth that had been buried for centuries. One evening he rode again toward the grove, unable to resist the pull, though he had no intention of re-entering the hollow. The setting sun cast long shadows across the land, painting the oak grove in shades of gold and black. The guardian oak loomed at its heart, silent and immovable, its branches swaying in a wind that seemed absent everywhere else. Ethan dismounted at the edge, his horse snorting and pawing nervously at the ground. He stood there for a long while, staring at the base of the tree where the earth had caved. Though he had covered the opening with soil and branches after his return, the memory of it was enough to chill him. He could still feel the air rising from it, cool against his skin, carrying the breath of centuries. The forest around him seemed alive, whispering through the leaves, creaking through the wood. He thought of the bones arranged around the altar, of the carvings on the stone walls, of the vast map etched into the rock. He thought of the voices that seemed to stir in the silence, the sense of eyes watching him even when the chamber had been empty. The longer he stood there, the more certain he became that he was not alone, not then and not now. The grove had claimed him in some way, bound him to its secret, and there was no turning back. When he returned to the ranch, the night was already deep, the sky scattered with stars. He sat outside the house, listening to the sounds of the prairie, the rustle of grass, the distant cry of a coyote, the soft shifting of cattle in their pens. Yet beneath those familiar sounds, he felt another presence, something deeper, woven into the land itself. He realized then that the grove was not simply a place of trees and soil. It was a boundary, a threshold between the world of men and the world that had come before, a world that refused to be forgotten. Ethan knew that silence would not free him from it. The secret had become his burden, as surely as the work of the ranch or the blood of his ancestors. Each day he carried it within him, and each day it grew heavier. The life he had known, the steady rhythm of chores, the comfort of habit, the certainty of the land, was slipping away. In its place was something he could not name, a shadow stretching from the past into his present, dark and unyielding. As he rose from his chair and stepped inside, closing the door against the night, Ethan felt the truth settle upon him. He could no longer pretend that he was merely a rancher, a man bound only to his cattle and his land. He had crossed into something larger, something that tied him to the forgotten dead and the secrets they had buried beneath the roots of the guardian oak. And though he wished to return to the simplicity he had once known, he understood with finality that such a return was impossible. The shadow of the past had fallen upon him, and it would not let him go. The days that followed settled into a rhythm that was outwardly no different from the ones Ethan had always known, yet within him everything had shifted. The chores of the ranch demanded his time, the mending of fences after a storm, the herding of cattle across the open land, the endless hauling of water from the well, but each task felt dulled by the weight of what he carried. Every creak of wood, every gust of wind across the prairie reminded him of the silence beneath the oak. He found himself glancing toward the grove even when he worked far from it, as though the roots of that ancient tree reached invisibly across the land to pull his gaze back. Nights became the hardest, when the sun sank behind the horizon and the stars pricked the sky. He would sit alone by the fire, staring at the flames as though they could burn away the images etched into his memory. The faces he had imagined in the carvings, the bones arranged in solemn patterns, the vast map scratched across the wall of the underground hall. They returned to him with startling clarity. He would close his eyes, hoping for rest, but the dreams that came were heavy with earth and stone, with whispers in languages he could not understand. He often woke before dawn, drenched in sweat, the sound of his own breath echoing as though he still walked the subterranean corridors. It was in the dim hours of morning, when the prairie lay quiet and the sky was only beginning to pale, that Ethan understood what must be done. The opening beneath the guardian oak could not remain. If left exposed, it would draw men sooner or later. Some hunter might stumble upon it, or children chasing each other through the woods, or worse still, prospectors who would see in it nothing but wealth to be taken. Ethan knew what would follow, the sacredness of the place broken, its silence shattered by greed and recklessness. The bones, the vessels, the altar, the map, they would all be hauled away, studied, sold, or destroyed, stripped of the meaning they had carried for centuries. He could not allow it. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the land in hues of copper and blood, Ethan saddled his horse and gathered the tools he would need. He took a spade, a pick, and a hatchet, their wooden handles worn smooth by years of use. He tied them securely to the saddle and set off toward the grove. His horse balked as it always did, tossing its head and rolling its eyes white. But he pressed it onward, his voice low and firm. The path to the grove was familiar by now, though it never ceased to carry the weight of foreboding. The prairie gave way to the clustered trees, and soon the looming silhouette of the guardian oak rose before him. The air there was cooler, the wind hushed, as though unwilling to disturb the stillness. Ethan dismounted, securing his horse to a post-like branch at the edge of the grove. The animal shivered and stamped its hooves, ears flat against its head, but Ethan gave it no comfort this time. His eyes were fixed on the hollow at the base of the oak, where the earth had sagged and where he had first descended into the past. Though he had covered it before with loose soil and branches, the memory of its breath still lingered, and in the fading light, he thought he could see the faint outline of the opening, waiting to swallow him once more. He set down his tools and began his work. With each swing of the spade, he drove dirt into the hollow, covering what he had once uncovered. He dragged heavy branches across the depression, layering them until they formed a tangled barricade. Stones pried loose from the edge of the grove he rolled into place, their weight pressing the earth down, sealing it tighter. Sweat poured from him as he worked, running into his eyes, soaking his shirt. But he did not stop. His arms ached, his back burned, yet the task held him steady. Each shovelful of soil was an oath, each stone a vow that what he had seen would not be desecrated by careless hands. The light dimmed as he labored, until the stars themselves watched over him. The grove became a shadowed cathedral, the branches arching high like the beams of a roof, the oak towering in silence like an ancient sentinel. He paused at last, leaning on the handle of his spade, chest heaving, Before him, the hollow was gone, replaced by a mound of earth and tangled debris, indistinguishable from the forest floor around it. Only he would know what lay beneath. Only he would remember the entrance that had once gaped open, inviting him into its depths. He stood there long after his work was done, staring at the mound as though expecting it to stir. The night air was cool, filled with the faint scents of earth and leaf, and the sound of an owl carried through the branches. Slowly, a calm began to settle over him. The unease that had haunted him since his first descent did not vanish, but it shifted into something else, something steadier, like the weight of responsibility rather than the bite of fear. He realized then that he was not merely concealing a passage, he was assuming a role that had perhaps always been waiting for him. The Caldwell family had lived on this land for generations, their lives bound to the prairie, the cattle, the soil. They had whispered stories of the grove, warned their children to keep away, carried down fragments of memory without ever speaking them in full. Ethan saw now that those stories had been more than superstition. They had been a charge, a duty passed from one generation to the next, waiting for the moment when one of them would be called upon to act. That moment had come for him. He gathered his tools, his movements slow and deliberate, and tied them once more to the saddle. His horse greeted him with a low whicker, eager to be gone from the grove. Ethan mounted, taking one last look at the mound beneath the oak. The guardian stood silent, its branches swaying slightly in the night breeze, as though acknowledging his act. He touched the brim of his hat, not in salute but in solemn recognition, and turned his horse back toward the ranch. The ride home was quiet. The stars shone above, vast and indifferent, yet Ethan felt their light differently now. He was a man changed, not by riches or fame, but by the burden of a secret he alone carried. The prairie stretched before him, endless and familiar, but he knew it had shifted as surely as he had. He was no longer simply Ethan Caldwell, rancher and caretaker of cattle. He had become something more, something heavier, and perhaps lonelier. He was the keeper of a truth, buried deep in the earth, the guardian of a silence that mustn't be broken. Back at the ranch, the fire in the hearth had died down, the house quiet in its rest. Ethan removed his boots and sat for a time in the darkness, listening to the faint crackle of the last embers. He thought of the years ahead, of days that would look much like the ones before, feeding livestock, mending fences, riding across the prairie. Yet he knew that beneath the surface of that ordinary life ran a current that others could not see. He bore within him the memory of the underground hall, the altar, the map, the bones, the weight of forgotten lives. And though no one else would ever know, it would shape every choice he made, every step he took. When he finally lay down, the silence of the land pressed close, not as a threat, but as a companion. He had taken the secret into himself, and it had accepted him in return. Sleep came slowly, but when it did, it carried him not into dreams of dread, but into the steady calm of acceptance. He was no longer a man caught between fear and wonder. He was what the grove had made him, the keeper of the secret, bound to the guardian oak, entrusted with the weight of the past. And as the night stretched on, the prairie breathed around him, vast and eternal, carrying with it the promise that some truths were meant not to be revealed, but to be preserved, hidden away beneath the roots of the world until time itself forgot them. Ethan Caldwell, rancher of the western frontier, would carry that truth alone, a sentinel of silence in a land that had seen too much to ever truly forget. If this story moved you, make sure to subscribe so you never miss the next one. Take a moment to watch the next video waiting for you right now. There are more powerful stories you won't want to miss. And don't forget to share this video with friends and family. Some stories are too meaningful to keep to yourself.